form follows function. This aphorism, tidy alliteration and whatnot, is claimed to form the essence of German design. Bauhaus, Ulmer Schule, Dieter Ramsay's body of work, they all are very German expressions of form follows function. Then there's the Mercedes W124, a piece of design whose every square inch seems to shout form follows function, a piece of design that could be called ostentatiously rational. A piece of design almost as German as the term Dienstaufwandsentschädigung. The W124 is the quintessential 80s Mercedes design, what with its square looks that are all about communicating solidity and efficiency. The latter aspect is the most striking, for it's a direct consequence of the W124 program's roots in the late 1970s, when several oil crises forced even the proudest of German car makers to add a significant reduction in fuel consumption among its top priorities. W124's shape bears witness to this effort, for despite its overall appearance being rather boxier than its predecessors, it actually is an awful lot more aerodynamically efficient. It's also an awful lot less glitzy than the previous W123 middle-class Benz, not because Daimler-Benz were being Swabian cheapskates when designing W124, but because opulence was intentionally avoided. W124 was styled in such a way that it looked expensive but not brash. Once more, this was a consequence of its roots in the 1970s, whose social upheavals and recessions find themselves represented in this almost austere saloon car shape. The sole exception, of course, being the chrome bar grille at the front that absolutely no self-respecting Mercedes-Benz design can do without. Other pieces of trim found on the car are made of a material far less ostentatious but no less exquisite than chrome. Anodized aluminium. Incredibly hard-wearing and with a dark, most discreet mother-of-pearl-like sheen, anodized aluminium fitted 80s Mercedes design like a custom-made Neapolitan three-piece suit. It's a material one needs to pay attention to in order to appreciate its luxury appeal. Each piece of W124 trim hence conveyed a message of superior quality through superior materials. Yet despite these dramatic changes vis-à-vis its predecessor, W124 always was and remains most recognizably a Mercedes-Benz. This is to do with what is catchily referred to as vertical affinity and horizontal homogeneity. In other words, every Mercedes model of the same generation was supposed to look quite similar, while retaining some tropes from previous generations. This standard was set to ensure that a Mercedes would forever look like a Mercedes, and that used car values wouldn't suffer too badly once a succeeding model was unveiled. Today, such a concept would likely be called visual sustainability. The mind behind vertical affinity and horizontal homogeneity was that of Bruno Sacco. Sacco was Mercedes' chief designer from 1975 to 1999. So yes, indeed, it was an Italian who was responsible for the most Germanic of car designs. Just like the first person to write down the three words form follows function was architect Louis Sullivan, an American. On some occasions, outsiders tend to have a clearer view of a country's culture than those being born into it. This certainly applies to Bruno Sacco, who not only mastered the German language to an extent that would put most native speakers to shame, but developed a genuine, fundamental fascination with his adopted home country's culture. The Mercedes-Benz designs of the 80s expressed this fascination and respect more eloquently than words ever could. Take the subtle highlight that starts at the edge of the rear boot, is continued across the rear window, and stretches the entirety of W124's roofline. Would most people notice? Of course not. But this detail, this expression of utter coherence, is perceived in one way or another. Or take W124's flanks, which, in typical Mercedes fashion, look as though they're made of thicker metal than the competition's. They aren't, but this impression is the result of the mastery of the Swabian clay modelers. These artisans turned the designer's sketches into three-dimensional objects made of metal that looked cast rather than pressed. Alongside these very special pieces of sheet metal, W124 features another trope
typical of 1980s Mercedes design, the exceptionally weak A-pillar base.
Take a look at this fine mess made of an unaligned bonnet and the crudest transition from the A-pillar to the front wing.
It's almost as though Mercedes design staff, after having applied so very much pernickettiness elsewhere across the car, had become so tired by the point this part of the car was supposed to be designed, they couldn't be bothered anymore.
Weak A-pillar notwithstanding, W124's exterior design is a monumental reminder of modernist German design values at their best.
The same cannot be said about the interior, though. It's just as inherently German as the exterior, but much less successful an exercise in precision and restraint.
Indeed, it was clearly intended to please the Werners and Karl-Heinzes of the 1980s, what with some very quaint upholstery options that wouldn't look out of place in a nursing home, and a rather unsophisticated dashboard architecture. That being said, the ergonomics are mostly fine, brilliant even from today's perspective.
And the quality of everything is utterly unimpeachable. And then there is this piece of zebrana wood trim, which used to stand for the Mercedes-Benz brand back in W124's day, almost as much as the three-pointed star on top of the grille. More than 2.5 million people were eventually convinced to pay significant amounts of money for this embodiment of German design values. From tens of thousands of taxi drivers, over just as many middle-class families, to captains of industry, keen on chasing Porsches on the Autobahn. One form for many functions, then. One form that never was about providing spectacle, but about the most rational kind of excellence. In other words, a very German form, indeed.